Welcome back to ZOO3649. This is lecture 14. And so we sort of got to the end of the selection part of this section, and now we're dealing with Mr. Mendel's part, which is the inheritance part. And incidentally, it is the part that Darwin didn't actually know. Well, he had an idea, but he wasn't right. So, if you consider Darwin's tenets of natural selection, you see that Darwin did realize that the traits that selection is involved in, they have to be passed on to the next generation. They have to be inherited to the next generation. So he did know that. So Darwin knew that the traits that natural selection worked on, whether it's a long tail or ears or whatever trait, color, beautiful color, whatever selection worked on, okay, it had to be passed on to the next generation, okay? Because if that didn't get passed on somehow, it didn't get inherited by the offspring, then selection couldn't work. In fact, it's the second tenet of natural selection, right? Traits must be heritable in order to be influenced by natural selection. So Darwin knew that they had to be inherited. He did know that. But what he didn't know was how the traits were inherited. Okay? So he knew that they had to be given from parent to offspring. Imagine these simple things that we know obviously now. In those days, they were not obvious. Okay? So Darwin knew that parents had to give something to the next generation. But he didn't know exactly what it was. Today, we know it's genes, it's DNA, right? But in those days, they had no idea what these things were. All right? So, actually, nobody even knew what a gene was, right? So, the big question then is not why are some individuals suited to their environments, why are some individuals not suited to their environment. That was natural and sexual selection answered those questions. Now the big question was what? By what means are traits inherited from one generation to the next? This was not actually an easy puzzle to figure out. Because, firstly, at that time, it was not even known which cells produced the material that could be inherited. For example, look at this little picture here. Okay? This is what we call a homunculus. Okay? And you see, they knew in the old days what a sperm looked like. And they really thought that at the head of the sperm is sitting this little version of a human being. Okay? And once and they look like this, yeah? And so once the sperm meets with the egg, this human that is inside the head of the sperm here can be born. That's obviously not the truth, okay? But the fact is that in those days nobody knew anything, so everybody came with their own ideas. Okay? What we did know even at that time is that the offspring must get something from their parents, right? I mean, if you look at yourself in the mirror and then you look at your two parents, you can see that you look like them, right? It's obvious. So we know your parents must have given you something. We didn't know it was DNA at that time, okay? And that's what these couple of lectures are all about. What is that thing? Yeah? And on top of that, you have two parents, right? Everybody has two parents. You can't be here by just having one parent. So, your mum gave you a certain trait. Your dad gave you a certain trait. So now, what happens when the two things that the thing that mum gives you is different to the thing that dad gives you for the same trait? Say dad says you have to be red and mum says you have to be blue. What are you going to be? How do the traits mix with each other when they're in your genome? Mum gave you one, dad gave you another. Now, how do those two that mum gave you mix or interact with each other? Huh? How did the traits that both parents give you interact with each other? Okay, it was not known. Okay, how do they work together? Do they combine? Do they mix? Do they compete with each other? One was better than the other. No one knew. No one had a clue. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you briefly, and some of you would have realized that this is very similar to a lecture you had in 2544, which is why I'm actually not going to spend too much time on this. We're not really going to be asked questions about pangenesis in this module. That's all second year stuff, right? And you know that pangenesis was Darwin's idea. He tried to explain that which cells were involved in the inheritance, right? And he said that these were gemmules and they came from all over the body and they got concentrated in the sex organs, and they were then given to the sperm, and the females are given to the egg, and sperm in the males and egg in the female, and then that's how they formed a zygote. Okay, we know that this was not true. Pangenesis also tried to explain how the parental traits interacted, right? So, two questions, right? How were they inherited? What tissue did it come from? And secondly, how did they interact? And Darwin said that under his idea, he thought the parental traits would blend. So, for example, if mum gives you red and dad gives you blue, you will look like something like a purple or pink or something like that, whatever this color is in between, right? That is called blending inheritance, and that was Darwin's idea, okay? In some cases, it seems to be true, right? You can see, for example, the example I gave you before, you can see that your face, you can see parts of your face in your dad's face. You can see parts of your face in your mum's face, right? So somehow your face is a blend between your mum and your dad's, right? So it seems to be a blend between your mum and your dad, right? But even Darwin realized that the idea that the parental traits, what mum gave you, what dad gave you, just blend and mix together, was wrong. Yeah? Because he knew that if the traits blended with each other, it would lead to what? Reduced variation. And remember, the first tenet of natural selection is variation. So Darwin realized that blending is not going to work. If you take two, blend it, you get one. What have you done to the variation? You've reduced it, right? So you've taken two. That means you had two variants. There you had variation. Now you've blended them together in the offspring. You have, once the parents die, you have less variation in the offspring because the offspring is only one color, right? Not two colors. So all the offspring. So in other words, if you keep blending, variation gets less and less and less and less. And then what happens? Natural selection can't work. So that's why Darwin kind of suspected that even he didn't have the right answer. Okay? And so a big fail for Darwin. And then came along August Weismann, who supported Darwin's ideas but didn't really agree with the idea of pangenesis. So, but he did come up with a theory that finally answered the question about which cells produced the material that could be inherited. Remember, Darwin tried to answer both questions by himself and failed at both, right? He tried to answer which cells, and he tried to answer how do they interact. Whereas actually you needed experts for both questions. So Weismann has now would answer this, which cells. And he came up with his germplasm theory, which you all know about. We're not going to go into this. This is really basic second year stuff. You're not going to get examined on this. This is just for background, okay? You're not going to get easy questions this year. All right, so we know about the germplasm theory. No exchange between germ and somatic cells. Absolute separation, okay? This means this is Weismann's barrier, and it is the final death knell for what? Lamarck's theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. If there is absolutely no barrier, no They're absolutely separate. If Weismann's barrier is separating germ and soma, whatever happens to the soma, in other words, what happens to your body is the soma, right? It's only your sexual organs which are the germ, right? So what happens in your soma is irrelevant for evolution, because if you could pass on the traits that happen to your soma, then you would then Lamarck would have been right. You can inherit a characteristic that has been acquired in the soma during the lifetime. Okay? So Weismann's barrier says that's just not possible. Okay? If you chop off your hand, and after you chopped off your hand, you go and have a baby with a girl, the baby is not going to have one hand. It's going to have two hands, right? So you can't give your chopped hand to your baby. It happened in your soma. If there's a mutation down there, in your germ cells, and you for example, you expose yourself to too much radiation or whatever, and those are mutated, those can be passed on to your kids. Okay? But nothing that happens to the rest of your body can be passed to your kids. Weismann's barrier. Okay, so the traits that are acquired during the lifetime of an organism cannot be inherited. So, again, it comes to, and again, you are not really going to get examined and asked, compare Darwin's idea and Mendel's idea about inheritance. That's the second year question. No, how did they interact? You're not going to get asked about that. This is for background, okay? You're not going to get examined on easy things. You will get examined for something from the lecture, but nothing easy like the questions from second year. Okay, those questions are for second year, and you're now in third year. You need to move on to a higher level of understanding. All right. So how do the parental traits interact? As you know, Mendel, funny enough, who was a monk in a monastery, come up with biology's greatest discoveries, and is, as a result of that, known as the father of genetics, which is incredible, really. Who was this father of genetics? Okay, we did spend a little time looking at Darwin's history. Well, Mendel was, let's put it like this, Darwin didn't like maths. Mendel liked maths. Okay, so he did maths and physics. He became a monk. He worked at a monastery, and in those days, monasteries were the actual centers of research, unlike today, where universities are centers of research. Back in those days, they had a monastery had libraries, beautiful libraries. They had labs. They had experiments running, and so in those days, during his studies in Europe, he met famous scientists, and when he returned, and these scientists inspired him. Remember, the same way some scientists in Cambridge inspired Darwin and arranged for him to go on that trip, remember? So when Mendel finished his studies, he came back to the monastery, and he was inspired by these guys in the biology department and in Vienna, and he wanted to do some experiments. So he started with the pea, the garden pea, Pisum sativum. And his experiments with peas are now absolutely world famous. He turned these peas into genetic theory, okay, Mendelian theory. And he used peas, you guys have been through this before, because the garden peas had distinct traits which are, here, wait for it, highly heritable. Okay? That means the genotype and phenotype are quite closely mapped to each other. Okay? What you see is reflected in the genes. And so because they're highly heritable, he could figure out a lot of the things he figured out. All right? So and with peas, there's so many good reasons for why peas, how many different characteristics they have. They can be cross-fertilized easily. They can be grown quickly. They put and Mendel kept records. Yeah, Mendel kept records. I insist that my honors and postgraduate students keep meticulous records, just for the same reason. Don't keep records, and if I ask you, what did you do 3 weeks ago? You better be able to tell me. If you don't have records, you will be unable to tell me. and that will be your ticket out of the lab. Okay? So being a scientist is dependent on keeping records, and good records. Okay? And working hard. Okay? Nothing comes for free. If you think it's going to be for free, try somewhere else. Science is not for you. So look at this. He bred 30,000 pea plants. 30,000. Not one or two. And he thought, Aish, it's enough. I'm done. I'm clocking off. No. He worked for years and years and years, and he just kept doing it. You see, greatness is not coming just like that. He was lucky to choose the peas for the simple reason because their traits follow a very strict form of inheritance. Okay, they're highly heritable. They form a very strict form, and this kind of inheritance today is called Mendelian inheritance, after the father of genetics. So he was, even though he was a priest, he was very fascinated by Darwin's theory of natural selection. He loved it, but he didn't like pangenesis. Yeah, just like Weismann, he didn't like pangenesis. He loved Darwin's idea of natural selection and evolution, but he didn't like pangenesis. So he said his reason why blended inheritance could not work. Remember, Darwin said blended inheritance can't really work because if you blend, you reduce variation, and natural selection needs variation. Well, there's another reason why blended inheritance can't work is if you blend it, right? So in a population, you have one individual who suddenly is different. Now, if you try and blend that individual into the population, what do you get? It's like if you take a drop of white paint and drop it into a bucket full of black paint. What do you get? Do you even see that there was a white paint dropped added? You don't. It disappears, right? That's another problem with blending, okay? That's another problem with blending. So blending can't work. How did the traits interact? If they're not blending, how are they interacting? Yeah? He knew in real life that there could not really be a blending. Okay? So he came up with the idea of particle inheritance. After he did his experiments, he concluded that traits were not blended. They were carried by tiny particles. And we know today these tiny particles are called what? They are called genes. And both the parental particles, or genes, were inherited whole by the offspring. Okay? So this is why he's called the father of genetics. He figured out that traits are passed from one parent to the offspring, both parents to the offspring, through particles. And they're inherited whole. Okay? So these two particles coming from each parent were called what? Alleles. Okay? That is the first time we figured out, oh, the particle is the gene. And they have two. One is coming from mom, one coming from dad. And if they're different, they're called alleles. Well, they're called alleles even if they're the same, right? If they're the same, it's a homozygous. If they're different, they're heterozygous. All right. So how did these particles interact? Mendel proposed the following laws. Okay, particulate inheritance, dominance. One allele will be dominant over the other allele, which will be recessive. The two parental alleles, okay, and the segregation part answers the question, how do we go from 2 to 2? What are you saying, Prof? I hear you asking. Let me explain it like this. How many chromosomes does your mum have? She's got 2, right? One from grandma and one from granddad. They gave her 2. She's got 2. How many does your dad have? Same, right? He's got 2 because his parents, so your grandma and granddad on your mom's side, gave him both, right? So dad's got 2, you've got 2, right? No, sorry. Dad's got 2, mom's got 2. How many do you have? It's not 4. It's also 2, right? So how do we go 2 plus 2 is equal to 2? How is that happening? that was that was the other thing he figured out, right? He said, no, 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 no. 2 and 2 will give you 2. Why? Because of segregation. Because what is happening with the 2 in dad? They're segregating, and then one is becoming a gamete, the other one is becoming a gamete. And I don't know which one is going to come to the offspring. Same for mom. They're segregating into 2 gametes. And you don't know which one the child is going to get. Could get this one, and another one from dad, and then they have 2. That's why the child only gets 1, right? And from dad, the child only gets 1. So then you see how mom and dad have 2, but they only give 1 to the child, thanks to the law of segregation, where the 2 of mom and dad actually segregate and become gametes. Okay? So he needed the law of segregation. And then when you look at more than 2 traits, and again he was lucky to look at 2 traits which are on different parts of the P chromosome, but he also found out that different traits, when they are on different chromosomes, they are able to assort independently. So there is no mixing between 2 traits if they are on different chromosomes. Okay, so those were Mendel's laws. You won't have many questions, I'm sure, because this is all repetition of second year. This is why we've been through this lecture quite quickly. The next lecture is also a refresher from second year, but I do encourage you, if you haven't done so already, please start filling out your practical guides. Time is running out, and soon we will start face-to-face pracs, which is 6, 7, and 8, and those 6, 7, and 8 have to be done after you've already done 1 to 5. So please do 1 to 5 ASAP. And I'll see you for the next lecture.